All right. Well, I'll dive into my intro and then I'll hand it over to the star of the show in a few moments here. So hello and welcome. My name is Victoria Verge, and I'm welcoming you today as an uninvited guest on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan people. As an education coordinator here at the Kelowna Art Gallery and on behalf of the board of directors and staff, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that we operate, gather, and benefit every day on the land of the Syilx Okanagan Nation. Now, tonight, we are kicking off our pop art lecture series, which is organized in conjunction with our current exhibition From Warhol to Banksy, that is on display here at the Kelowna Art Gallery until October 16th. From Warhol to Banksy features over 120 works by some of pop art's most notable artists, all from the collection of local avid art collector and lawyer Paul Mitchell and wife Tracy Mitchell. Now, to begin our lecture series, we are joined by curator and writer Jon Davies as he takes us through an exciting lecture titled Andy Warhol and Queer Culture. Now, before we begin, I'll give you a little bit of information about Jon. Jon Davies is a curator, writer, and PhD candidate in art history at Stanford University, where he's completing a dissertation entitled The Fountain, Art, Sex, and Queer Pedagogy in San Francisco, 1945 to 1995. He has held curatorial positions at the Power Plant Contemporary Art Gallery, Oakville Galleries, and the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto. His book, Trash, a Queer Film Classic, was published by Arsenal Pulp Press in 2009, and his anthology, More Voiceover, Colin Campbell Writings, was published by Concordia University Press in 2021. So thank you for joining us tonight, Jon. Just a few quick housekeeping rules before I hand it over. So for our audience, please save your questions till the end of the talk. We'll have a 10 to 15 minute Q&A period then. Just type your questions into the chat bar and I will read them out loud to Jon for him to answer. And also please note that today's lecture is being recorded for future viewing. So if you know someone who'd like to check it out later, you'll be able to find it on our website in the coming days. All right, so that's everything from me. Thank you so much. And Jon, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for coming this evening. And I just want to thank Christine and Victoria for inviting me to speak in the context of the exhibition From Warhol to Banksy. So let me just share my screen. Okay. So I'm going to be talking specifically about the American artist Andy Warhol, and probably more has been written about him than any other artist. A curator at the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh says that his life and work is almost like the Bible in terms of how much material and how many stories one can find in it. But there's always some new facet to explore. And a lot of thinking has been done on Warhol as a queer artist. I thought I would start with talking about how I came to be interested in Warhol and to spend such a long time thinking about him and his work. I grew up in the suburbs of Montreal, and my family didn't go to museums, but I really distinctly remember seeing a Warhol wall calendar in a bookstore, probably at the mall, and one artwork in it really resonated with me. And I put it up on my wall, and it was probably there for many years. So this would have been in the early 1990s. I was born in 1980. And if you had a sense of being different from the other boys, there's not a lot of representation of queer or trans people around you. Most of what you saw were images of people dying of AIDS. And you had a feeling that maybe that was the future that lay ahead of you. But you weren't really able to articulate that or put that into words. It was more of a feeling. And maybe you also knew that the suicide rate among queer or trans teenagers was extremely high. And so that kind of presented itself as possibly a future ahead of you as well. So, you know, against that kind of dark backdrop, I knew that this image was kind of speaking to me or reflecting me in some mysterious way. And then over time, Warhol, and also just the kind of identity or role of being an artist in the world, came to represent a more kind of colorful, exciting way of life than the kind of drab everyday around me. And it became a way of not just imagining having a future, but also one in the company of other people who are different in different ways. And I think that was maybe the start of my thinking about art and the start of my inability to have any kind of emotional detachment between what I study and the things that I feel attached to or want to be a part of. So today I'm going to talk briefly about Warhol's early life and career, but what I'm mostly going to focus on are his amazing films, because I think that the universe of feelings, experiences, and social environments being articulated and shaped through Warhol's camera is where we find a queer Warhol at his most revelatory. So Warhol made hundreds of films between 1963 and 1969, and then he withdrew them from circulation in 1970 to focus on other projects. And they were out of circulation for almost 20 years until 1988, when he reluctantly gave them to the Whitney Museum of American Art, which initiated a project to preserve them that is still ongoing now, 35 years later. So just imagine thousands of reels of 16mm celluloid film. And it's not necessarily clear which of those reels he considered to be finished films and which are fragments or tests or sketches. But there's thousands of them, and you have to figure out what they are, catalog them, identify the people in them, and preserve them to make sure that they can be seen in the future. So the legacy of that, the fact that they were out of circulation for 2 decades, is that they're still quite difficult to see. Even though they have started being digitized, they're still not widely accessible. And partly that has to do with copyright and control over his estate and things like that as well. But they're still being cataloged today. So on the right here is the new second volume of the Catalogue Raisonné of Warhol's films. And Catalogue Raisonné means basically just an attempt to comprehensively catalog every single work by an artist. So the first volume, which is on the left, focused entirely on his screen tests. And it took the researcher Callie Angel 15 years to write it, and it came out in 2006. And after she passed away suddenly, the second volume took a scholar named John Hanhart another 15 years to write, with a number of other contributors. And so that just came out recently. And something I think about a lot is how artworks sometimes belatedly find their ideal audience. Like a painting from the 1920s might not make sense to people at the time, but then could really have an impact on how people see the world, 50 or 100 years later. So I think it's important to consider what that meant for Warhol's films to have been inaccessible and invisible throughout the 1970s and 1980s. For one, having access to these Warhol films could have really changed how queer and trans people saw themselves and represented themselves. And when Warhol's films came out of hiding in the late 1980s, they seem to have foreshadowed the idea of queer that was newly coming into fashion, a slur that had been recuperated by GLBT and AIDS activists and by academics to name whatever troubled kind of binaries between homosexual and heterosexual, or between male and female. Queer was kind of seen as like a force that disrupted identity categories more than identity in itself. So it's fascinating to imagine how queer culture and theory may have evolved differently if these very queer films were available to see and discuss 2 decades earlier in the 70s and 80s. And the art historian Douglas Crimp claims that Warhol's films matter, quote, not because they reflect or refer to a historical gay identity and thus serves to confirm my own now. But because his cinema disdains and defies the coherence and stability of all sexual identity, that to me is the meaning of queer, and it is a meaning we need now in all its historical richness, he says. So I want to think about a queer Warhol in two different ways. One is the question of visibility, and the other is the question of authorship or identity. I know there's no slide up right now. Yeah, it's just a pause in the slides.
Sorry.
I probably should have, noted that. So I'm interested in the question of visibility and also the question of authorship or identity as being something plural rather than singular. So the 1960s were a time when there was a greater awareness of gays and lesbians, but always kind of through a lens of the mainstream analyzing a minority that they largely saw as a social problem. So there's a kind of acknowledgement that they existed, but which was an improvement from in the past, but they were still kind of seen as a social problem. And Warhol's play with authorship and identity in his work and in his films from this decade can be seen as a queer strategy for avoiding being pinned down, a way of keeping queerness kind of underground and apart from dominant society, and therefore keeping a certain power that comes from not being seen and known and dissected by sociologists and psychologists. So Warhol was born in 1928 and grew up in a working class, very Catholic Eastern European immigrant family in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And as a kid, he was quite pale and sickly and spent a lot of time in bed reading comics. And Warhol studied at the Carnegie Institute of Technology, and he moved to New York to work as a commercial artist, where he began doing illustrated advertisements and store window displays for different companies. So in New York in the 1950s, being gay was a private matter, something that one could live out among friends, but not really express freely in the public sphere. So with the experience of living in the closet, queer people had to learn to communicate in code, and they became well-versed in seeing beneath the surface of things and kind of picking up on the subtle hidden meanings of gestures or words or objects as a way of kind of identifying one another and communicating with one another, but also to kind of make a place for themselves. So Warhol achieved great success with his illustrations for the I. Miller Shoe Company, which you see here. And these circulated widely in magazines and became synonymous with the brand itself. The shoe ads became a kind of signature for him. And in his drawings, shoes became stand-ins for people, suggesting that you can tell a lot about a person from the shoe they wear. And this is kind of a key theme of pop art, that consumer products could have all the personality attributes and individuality that human beings do. And the people's lives were becoming more and more synonymous with their public images, which could go in and out of fashion. But the shoe also crept into Warhol's private life, as we see in this work called To All My Friends from 1957. So here each shoe embodies one of Warhol's friends, who would mostly be other young gay men working in arts, culture, fashion, and advertising in New York. And on one hand, there's a strong sense of collectivity and community here. But on the other hand, each shoe is distinct to the person it's named for, and you'd have to be a part of that scene to really get all the intended meanings, like why Nathan would be a platform heel and Calvin is more of a comfortable flat. These are things we can't really, the historian can't really know these things. You have to be part of the community to know that. At the same time, Warhol was making drawings of beautiful boys and showing these at a small gallery. And the art world was not really interested in what they saw as frivolous and maybe feminine gay pictures. And he was also drawing kind of ornate penises and keeping those to himself or within his circle of gay friends. So there are many levels of visibility operating here, just in what Warhol and his pen are doing. From the most private realm of something, or from the most private realm to something shared with like-minded others, to the gallery system and to the mass media of magazine advertising. And kind of every level of public visibility has a different kind of level of intimacy or kind of aspect of Warhol that they're allowed to see. And to add a further layer to this, Warhol's hand, his drawing, was highly valued in the advertising world because he provided a kind of personal, nostalgic touch that modern advertising photography could not. So a lot of people were using photography at this time to create advertisements, but his were all kind of handmade or hand-drawn. But the text in a lot of his advertisements was not usually his own. It was actually that of his mother, Julia Warhola, who lived with him for many years in New York. And her handwriting was used even to sign his own name, which I think is kind of amazing. So his own signature in this period was in his mother's hand. And as his career took off, it was not even written by her, but by an assistant named Nathan Gluck. So one curator claims that the signature kind of becomes like collectivized with this. And, this really runs counter to our sense of handwriting and the signature as being, the mark of one person and their individuality. So instead, it kind of expands the authorship, and the advertisement becomes a site for kind of conjoining both the mother's hand and the son's hand together. And of course, in like the pop psychology of the time, like gay men were seen as having been too close to their mothers in childhood. And so here it's like they're actually fused into like one hand. So if handwriting is seen as a distinctive marker of identity that signifies the writer's inner self, no such truth about Warhol can be found here. So from very early on in Warhol's career, before he turned to fine art, his hand and his identity was not alone, but multiple in this kind of cross-generational and cross-gender collaboration with his mother, as well as something that could be standardized and outsourced to his assistant. And this question of Warhol's hand and the idea of kind of authenticity becomes central when he decides to move from the commercial art world and towards the fine art world in the 1960s. So I think he's aware that his drawings of boys aren't really getting a lot of traction. They're not really what's, serious galleries want to see at that moment. But he maintains an interest in consumer objects from his advertisements and commercial work, like a Coca-Cola bottle or a Campbell's soup can. And his early fine art work, this would be like the early 60s, tries to replicate packaging as closely as possible and really trying to avoid any sign of his individual hand. So it looks like it could be produced by a machine. And this piece especially represented like a kind of turning point. I forget all the details of the story, but basically he showed a friend a more kind of hand-drawn version of a Coca-Cola bottle, and then showed a friend this version. And, this was very new, that somebody would exhibit an artwork that was really almost like an exact replica of an advertisement. So he was very interested in trying to kind of erase the kind of personal touch or brushstroke as much as possible with these new pop paintings that he was doing. So similarly, when he made the paintings he's now best known for of celebrities like Marilyn Monroe or Elvis Presley, he used both found mass media images and an industrial screen printing technique that anyone could operate. So he neither took the photograph that is the source of this painting, nor did he necessarily have to be the one in the room operating the screen printer. So his, authorship was in the idea to do this. So, in the selection of content, in the design, and not in its actual execution. So he set up a studio for producing his paintings in 1963, and he called it the Factory. So the Factory wasn't just a place where Warhol and his assistants silkscreen paintings and made other artworks, but also a social and creative hotbed where a new kind of person could be produced. It was a space for both work and play, business and pleasure, and it attracted people from all walks of life. So this was a time when young queer people were fleeing small towns and suburbs to descend on New York, San Francisco, and other big cities that allowed for more anonymity and sexual experimentation and kind of self-creation away from the eyes of one's family of origin. So the Factory attracted a wide range of people, including celebrities and avant-garde artists, young aristocrats who kind of dropped out of high society and were hanging out with an edgier crowd, slumming, you would say, and then also queer homeless or street-involved kids. And it's really mythologized as a place with a lot of class, gender, and sexual mixing. But of course, this meant there were also tensions and conflicts that played out there. It wasn't really like a utopian, completely open space, but it was a space where a lot of kind of productive mixing could happen. And one of the most striking characteristics of the Factory, the first Factory, is that it was painted silver and covered in reflective surfaces. So you were constantly kind of aware of your own image and how it was performed. And this is some of the graffiti on the walls. And Warhol has written about his love for what he called leftovers. And you could say that many of the people who were drawn to the Factory in being queer or kind of outsiders were left out or left over from mainstream society or from traditional ways that people were expected to live and behave. And so they were looking for kind of new ways of living based more on the pursuit of pleasure and freedom. So the Factory is kind of like a laboratory for trying out or playing with new identities and social possibilities. And film was really the medium to make this happen and also to preserve it for the future. Though I guess he didn't really have a sense that, I think he had a more, his approach to film was more that it was disposable. I think like he wasn't thinking of the films being preserved into the future. I think he would have one project and then move on to the next one and not really think about the future. But as a historian, I'm very happy that the films exist to document and archive and preserve that social world. So Warhol acquired his first 16mm film camera in 1963. And his early films were silent and had simple literal titles like Sleep, Eat, and Empire. And they were radically reductive, so recording one thing either in real time or extended in duration, so that one is watching this activity for much longer than necessary. And the best example is probably Empire, which is recording the Empire State Building over one night. And so it lasts 8 hours when it's projected. And if Hollywood films promise an exciting narrative, and experimental films of the time were typically aiming to capture somebody's internal kind of psychological vision, Warhol's first films were very different. They were distilled down to one act or object or idea. And I think my favorite example is Kiss. So in a Hollywood film, the triumphant kiss between the hero and heroine typically ends the film in a way that kind of reestablishes the heterosexual order, you could say. But Warhol's film gives us only the kiss, setting aside everything else in the narrative, even cropping it so, it's just focused on their faces. He also makes each kiss last far longer than it should, which kind of amps up like the erotic energy. And he also kind of multiplies the kiss by including a variety of couples of different genders and races. And Kiss was one of the first of his films to be exhibited and become really celebrated. And it really embodies this kind of silent, slowed down film practice. But I think we can also think of the kiss as kind of initiation or kind of first act. So the repetition in it allows for what the sexuality scholar Gail Rubin calls benign sexual variation. So it gets you used to the idea that there are many ways that other people kiss and or have sex, and it's not an attack on what you do or on your own values, but it's more this kind of representation of variety, I guess, and kind of non-threatening variety, you could say. And also the film was kind of open and unfinished. So, I forget how many kisses were in the version that circulated most, but let's say it was 12 or 15 kisses, but it could be added to or taken away from and change the order and manipulated over time. So there's no, not necessarily like a finished kiss or finished version of kiss. And this also suggests that there's kind of an infinite number of more kisses that are possible that are outside of the frame. So as much as we want to read kind of, sexual identities into the people on screen, we also don't really know necessarily about people's relationships or identities. All we know is that they kissed in front of Warhol's camera, and but we don't necessarily know who they dated or how they identified. And I think this is kind of a nice example of how queer kind of evades what Jennifer Doyle calls the articulation and production of concrete categories of sexuality and gender. And I was interested to learn how important one of the performers, Naomi Levine, who you see on the bottom, was to the film. And it was possibly her who gave Warhol the idea for the film, and she referred to it as our next movie. So Warhol's films really drew on the energies and ideas of the friends and people around him. And so I always get suspicious when people claim that Warhol is kind of a singular genius who is solely responsible for everything produced under his name. I think, he directed the films, but I feel like dwelling too much on his individual authorship actually goes against the spirit of the work. And I think it's not so much about one artist, but about the kind of social and creative universe that he made possible. And I think that's a really important thing that artists do, is kind of create these worlds of kind of possibility. And, this is now documented and preserved for us in the films. And Kiss is very much kind of a kiss for the 1960s, capturing some of the possibilities that were finally being acknowledged and more out in the open. So this interracial kiss between Rufus Collins and Naomi Levine would have been unshowable in many parts of the United States in 1963. So the Loving versus Virginia Supreme Court case that overturned bans on interracial marriage did not take place until 1967. And the lynching murders of Black men were often based on false accusations of looking at or speaking to white women. So, this is a very kind of potent scene, and it would have played differently in New York City than it would have in, the South or other parts of the US. I think maybe it's important to remember that the 60s weren't really the 60s as we think about them until later in the decade. Like the first half of the decade was maybe more like a hangover of the 1950s. So Other of his films were more sexually explicit, made at a time well before moving image pornography was publicly accessible, and well before there was any kind of candid queer representation at all. So Couch from 1964 very matter-of-factly records the activities taking place on one of the factory's couches. And the couch kind of embodies the factory as a site where private and public blur, as we see different couplings and threesomes, and people are having sex next to people just hanging out. And often, somebody might come in to do some vacuuming or some other chores while sex is happening on the couch. And so it kind of makes it kind of more everyday or mundane when you kind of juxtapose these things together and kind of remove some of the spectacle or the scandal from the explicit sexuality. And Couch broke many taboos, and in doing so, it actually opened Warhol up to the possibility of being charged with obscenity. So, the film captures how the factory kind of nurtured queer and other sexual experimentation. But once these activities were actually put on film, they risked being seen by people outside of this world. So the police regularly visited the factory and kept tabs on Warhol and his friends. I believe there was a FBI file on Warhol, though there was probably an FBI file on every artist at this time. And it's kind of a lesson that if you set up a camera, it'll act as a kind of catalyst or spark for performance. So people are drawn to the camera and they want to act for it and act out for it. And this is even more true of queer people who were denied visibility in the public sphere. So Warhol's films really capture this kind of people's really potent desire for self-expression and self-fashioning. So in being filmed, you kind of become public, and you're kind of memorialized. And this is most apparent in Warhol's hundreds of screen tests, which he shot between 1964 and 66. And they document the many faces, famous and forgotten, who hung out at or came through the factory over those years. So regulars and one-time visitors alike were asked to hold still while a 3-minute, 100-foot film reel ran through Warhol's camera, which you see on the right in this image on a tripod. And sometimes Warhol would stay and sometimes he'd wander away, but the subjects struck their pose or did whatever they wanted to do for the 3 minutes. But this inevitably felt like much longer. Often they were kind of abandoned by Warhol, who'd wander off. They were not given little to no direction and were just kind of face to face with the camera's gaze. And I think we're very used to having cameras on us and around us all the time. But I think if you actually kind of sat with what 3 minutes, like how long 3 minutes would actually feel like, you would get a sense of kind of how unnerving this experience could be. So some people try not to blink and their eyes well up with tears. Others fight against the passing of time by making faces or entertaining friends off screen. This is one of the writer Susan Sontag's several screen tests, and she, I think, was very uncomfortable under the gaze and is often kind of joking or trying to dispel the tension. So from the one-to-one confrontation of face and camera, each screen test captures a unique self as it's transformed into a cinematic subject. So the series kind of acts as a catalog of ways of being provoked by the camera. So with a diversity of individuals all identically simply framed, they show how an aura of glamour can be generated simply by how light falls on a face. And the screen tests are also an example of Warhol specifically referencing the structures and stars of Hollywood, where screen tests would usually be performed in order to see how an aspiring actor would look and behave on camera, kind of register on camera. So when Warhol acquired a sound camera in 1964, so his first camera was silent, and then the one in 1964 recorded sound alongside the image, similar to how video works now. He needed someone to make sounds for his movies. So he met the prolific young playwright, Ronald Tavel, who you see here. And Tavel was hired to write scenarios for Warhol from 1964 to 66. And Tavel had founded the Theater of the Ridiculous, and his scenarios for Warhol similarly placed people into kind of banal or cliched or kind of absurd situations. And it was more about creating kind of interpersonal sparks from these staged kind of contrivances. So it was almost a way of annoying or irritating the stars into kind of interacting with each other, right? It's very much about kind of provoking performances. So the films that resulted from their collaboration are emptied out of plot and narrative, and instead they set up sort of situations from which drama can arise. So, it really puts the focus on the performer, and, they very, very rarely worked with trained actors, but rather with the particularly funny or beautiful or interesting people in Warhol's circle at the factory, whom he called superstars. So the superstars kind of ran the gamut from verbose beauties like Edie Sedgwick and Mary Warnoff or Viva, to witty gay men like Taylor Mead, Ondine, or Eric Emerson. And there were also straight men like Joe D'Alessandro and Paul America, who are kind of strong, stoic, kind of foils to the chattier women and gay men that Warhol was drawn to. So cinema was not really about what the director could create, but about how a performer reveals themselves to the camera and being filmed. And this is a photograph of Richard Avedon that kind of captures some of the characters, the superstars around the factory. So a good example of a Warhol-Tavel collaboration was Horse. So again, keeping with these very simple titles. And four men were playing different kind of stereotype roles from Hollywood Western film. So one was called Tex, one was called Mex, one was called Sheriff, and one was called the Kid. And they just kind of gathered around this live horse that had been rented from a film company, I believe, and brought up in the freight elevator to the factory. So instead of memorizing a script, they were just kind of thrown in front of the camera, and then Ronald Tavel put up kind of cue cards with their lines and directions. So there was no rehearsal. They were just kind of being told what to do, like in the moment, and then reacting in the moment. And then in this film called The Life of Juanita Castro, all the actors appear on camera at the same time. So there's no entrances or exits. They sit in these kind of like this bleacher kind of formation, and then and then Tavel, who's there kind of in the middle right of the top row, looking down, he is also on camera as the director the entire time, and he kind of feeds them their lines one by one. So he'll say, this is your line, this is your line. So it's completely exposing all the acts of directing that are usually happening hidden off screen. And then in one called Kitchen, which I really love, starring Edie Sedgwick, copies of the script are simply left lying around the set, which was, somebody's kitchen in their apartment. So if ever somebody forgot a line, they could just look it up. on one of the scripts that were littered around. And then Edie Sedgwick was told that if she forgot a line, she should just sneeze instead. So there's kind of, there's dialogue, but then it's punctuated with these sneezes. And so they're all these collaborations with Ronald Tavel are very stripped down and kind of bare bones. And, the camera very rarely moves. The work of directing a film is all happening in front of you. And, there's not really a sense of there being stage and an off stage. It's like everything kind of blurs together. So something else that happens in Kitchen is like a still photographer will come on and take snapshots of the film as it's happening, but he gets between the camera and the actors. They also would read out the credits out loud rather than have them be written down. They're very theatrical. There's like almost no editing. And so they kind of, they take place usually in real time. And so it really creates a strong sense that what's unfolding is kind of spontaneous and unrepeatable, and that you're really kind of catching a kind of real quality of people's personalities, because they're kind of put in like a situation of like duress or kind of like a stress position or something. So I think they're really remarkable for kind of refusing to acknowledge where the real world ends and performance begins. And, similarly, the line between on and off screen space is erased. And this comes out of this kind of conflicted collaboration between Warhol and Tavel, where they're both kind of exerting power as directors in a way. And Douglas Crimp calls this, quote, coming together to stay apart, unquote, which I really like. I'm very into this idea of like people who are very different from each other being able to coexist and kind of create something together, but without flattening the differences between them. And I feel like Warhol's kind of universe is a really good example of that. So I think it's apparent that these films are pretty much the complete opposite of what Hollywood was known for. But Warhol really venerated Hollywood and worshipped especially female stars, and was not only interested in critiquing it. And now that he could make sound films, Warhol kind of drew more explicitly on Hollywood, and he was part of a social and artistic milieu that were kind of united in their love of Hollywood and its stars. And this kind of adoration was pretty widespread among gay men, as well as drag queens and trans women in post-war America. And it kind of sets them apart from other experimental filmmakers who really saw what they were doing as being anti-Hollywood and something opposite from Hollywood. Whereas this was very much like kind of both critical but celebratory of Hollywood. So, as a child, Warhol went to many films. It was extremely common activity to go to multiple films a week. He collected stars' autographs. And I think attending the movies religiously and kind of identifying with these powerful, kind of larger than life images of actresses allowed gay boys like him to kind of vicariously experience a kind of emotional excess and glamour that was kind of forbidden to them in everyday life. So in the dark of the cinema, you could kind of get a reprieve from having to perform a certain kind of masculinity in order to fit in with the other boys. So, I think, especially with boys, like there was so much policing, making sure that they weren't sissies, that they weren't effeminate. And this was really happening at school, it was happening in sports, it was happening at home. But then kind of in the dark of the movie theater, you could, really lose yourself in like Betty Davis or Lana Turner or somebody like that. So some scholars have seen this as kind of a survival strategy. And I wanted to quickly mention Warhol's 1975 series, Ladies and Gentlemen. And this print of Vicky Peters is in the Kelowna Art Gallery exhibition. And for this series, all the models were recruited from the Gilded Grape, which was a hangout for Black and Latinx drag queens and trans women that was close to the factory. So Hollywood actresses and all their glamour were an important kind of touchstone for fashioning oneself as a woman. And Warhol saw being a woman as something that took a lot of work and effort, and he kind of valued drag queens and trans women because in his mind, they often seem to have to work twice as hard to kind of pull off the work of being a woman. And so I think there's a very intense relationship between queer or trans people and movies. And, in the post-war era, there was so much pressure to be very discreet and to hide one's true self. And so a scholar named Brett Farmer says that queer people were more kind of drawn to what he calls cinema's promise of visibility, escapism, and emotional discharge. So I think I'm running out of time a little bit, so I'm just gonna quickly wrap up. But there was this kind of love and veneration of Hollywood, but there was also an understanding that it was a myth, basically. So between the mid-1930s and mid-1960s, there's something called the Hays Production Code, and it basically enforced a very strict kind of puritanical set of rules of what could be shown in Hollywood films. So it prohibited any trace of homosexuality being represented, as well as prostitution, drug use, and abortion. And it ensured that if there was any wrongdoing by a character, that they would be punished at the end of the film. Like you couldn't even show somebody enjoying like a life of crime, like by the end of the film, like they had to be punished. So when Warhol was making films in the mid-60s, any gay characters in Hollywood films were likely to commit suicide at the end of the film. Like that was just kind of what was written into, Hollywood. So I think kind of queer people were very attuned to kind of reading between the lines, and they were interested in the kind of scandalous behavior that was often happening off screen in Hollywood. So, the Hollywood films would have this kind of very moralizing kind of facade, but then people knew that there was often like a lot of debauchery and things happening off screen. And so I think the Warhol films with Tavel are really striking because they show kind of all the messy power dynamics and the bad behavior that Hollywood movies always pushed to the side and kept hidden. And, I think you could say Hollywood was kind of very hypocritical in kind of how it presented itself, whereas the Warhol and Tavel films kind of show you everything, or kind of don't pretend to be something that they're not, I guess. So I see the factory as kind of a queer shadow to Hollywood. So I wanted to basically, I'll skip over this, but there are a few films that Warhol and Tavel made together in the mid-60s where they cast the superstars to play real actresses, and kind of dramatizing these kind of dark moments in their lives that they read about in the tabloids, basically. So this is a film called Lupe with Edie Sedgwick that was about the suicide of actress Lupe Velez. This film starred Mario Montez on the left as Lana Turner, about her doomed relationship with a mobster. And then this film, Hedy, was about the actress Hedy Lamarr's 1966 arrest and trial for shoplifting. So it was almost like Warhol was producing like tabloids himself, like a story would break, and then he would get together, his superstars, and then make like their film version of like, a scandal that just erupted. So it's very responsive and like very quick. Like it's really not how films are typically made. And Mario Montez was the leading lady in those two films, and was Warhol's first kind of drag superstar. And it was born Renee Rivera, and was kind of shy. He like worked for the post office during the day. But he fell in with kind of this queer circle around Warhol, as well as Jack Smith. And he was kind of lover, roommate, model, muse in this kind of community. And so let me just skip to the end so we have time for questions. That's more Mario Montez, who's really incredible performer. That's a film called Harlot with Mario Montez as Jean Harlow. Maybe I'll just end with this quote from the writer Wayne Kostenbaum. He writes, "Warhol had a special way of casting light on the ruin, a way of making it spectacular, visible, audible. He didn't consciously harm people, but his presence became the proscenium for traumatic theater. Pain in his vicinity rarely proceeded linearly from aggressor to victim. Trauma without instigator was simply the air everyone around him breathed. To borrow a religious vocabulary often useful in Warhol's case, he understood that people were fallen. Standing beside him, they appeared more deeply fallen, even if his proximity, the legitimacy he lent, the spark he borrowed and returned, promised them the temporary paradise of renown." And I'll end there just to give us a few minutes for questions, but I'm happy to talk about the turn that his films took after 1966, and kind of the kind of last act of his films before he moved on to other projects. And he was shot by a woman named Valerie Solanas in 1968, and that was kind of the end of him being kind of an active director, and a lot of the directing duties of the film fell to a man named Paul Morrissey, who I really like his films. A lot of people try to separate him from Warhol, but there was really kind of a continuity. But Paul Morrissey kind of took over the filmmaking at the factory in the late 60s, especially after the shooting. And yeah, and then we had this 20 years of the films not being seen, and now we have a better chance of seeing them. But as I said, they're still difficult to access, and hopefully once they're digitized, there'll be ways of them circulating more widely. But I'll just end it there. Thank you very much for listening. I know that was a lot of material, but yeah, thanks. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Jon. That was really wonderful. I think it's so great to shed some light on this like lesser known side of Warhol's work. I mean, many people are familiar with Andy Warhol. You think of Coca-Cola, you think of soup cans, you think of bright, colorful Marilyn Monroes, but the video and the film production is slowly coming to light. So it's really great to have an in-depth chat surrounding that subject. So thank you so much for that. So yes, if any of our listeners have any questions, feel free to type them in below. I will read them out loud. But in the meantime, maybe as we're waiting for folks to gather their thoughts, if you had anything else you wanted to add, I know you kind of rushed yourself a little at the end, or yeah, feel free to continue if there's another little tidbit you might have that you think we'd enjoy.
Yeah, I mean, I think the films to me are really the kind of window into the wider social world and context. And you know, I love the individual paintings and the prints and you know, the Brillo boxes. And but I think for me, I've always really been excited by the kind of life of the artist and the way that they're part of these wider kind of communities and social worlds that were really trying to live by their own kind of moral codes or like ethos or like you know, kind of lifestyle that was just very different from dominant society. And so I just really love that the films are kind of this incredible vast kind of archive of his own social world, but in a really kind of narrow period of time. And you know, people talk about the modern kind of gay rights movement as beginning with the Stonewall riots in 1969, and that was actually like the end of Warhol's film practice. So it was like all of this is kind of before what we think of like liberation, but it's like there was nothing holding back these people in these performances and the way they interact with each other. It was completely like this kind of free space in front of his camera. So I just find that really inspiring.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, he definitely experienced some dark times, to say the least, and I feel like you don't necessarily see this struggle or darkness in some of his prints, but they certainly come through in the video. Yeah, it's, I mean, like you briefly mentioned at the end there with him being shot, and then with him also growing up as a young boy, I know he was quite ill. So, I mean, death and illness seem to also surround him and incorporate itself into his life. So knowing that this came through somehow into his work is sort of, to see that release, I think is really, it's helpful, I think, as a viewer of his work to notice these things, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think like just to survive, like as a gay person at that time, you kind of had to be able to transform pain and difficult things into something else. And so I think like the idea of like a camp sense of humor was like a way of navigating those very dark experiences, and kind of it became almost like a shared language or something like that. And what you're saying, I think really resonates to me with like the way that him and his friends would be looking at Hollywood films, and there was like a kind of escapism or kind of trying to kind of disappear into the film in a way, or like I think it's actually quite a complicated kind of dynamic of like what they were seeing when they were looking at these films. But also like a fact that I find really interesting was so many of the classical Hollywood films were showing up on television in the 1960s. And there's something different about seeing something on the big screen versus seeing it in your home on a TV. And it's almost like it becomes something that you can play with or like domesticate, or like it can become part of your, you know, his language as an artist or whatever, when it's made small that way, I think. And actually Mario Montez like collected like recorded a lot of these off of the TV and had like a huge archive of like soundtracks and stuff that other artists ended up using. So it was really like this shared kind of obsession. And I feel like things like that make you look at the Marilyn Monroe images or the Elvises in a different way when you think of this kind of whole community that was like fixated on Hollywood, but from this kind of queer perspective.
I guess copyright wasn't as big of an issue. Just recording their music and soundtracks and just using it in their own stuff.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's fun. Like, I wish I could have shown a clip here of one of the films. You could look for them on YouTube, or there's probably you know, you could look online, but yeah, the copyright is funny because for the artists themselves, they weren't thinking about it, but now like Warhol's estate and like it's all, you know, becomes very protected and the circulation becomes more controlled. And it's funny because it isn't, you know, he stole so many things, but now the films are like very guarded in a way. And but hopefully when the digitization project is complete, I would hope that they would at least circulate more widely to universities and libraries and museums and stuff like that. So rather than scholars.
Definitely an important part of his repertoire that I think the vast majority needs to know about. So it'd be great if it was more accessible, and hopefully in the near future we accomplish that. But it doesn't seem like we've got any questions from the audience. We do have thank yous and beautiful comments. So thank you for those who joined us this evening. Anyone who didn't, we will have this posted up online, like I said. But Jon, is there anything you'd like to say in closing tonight?
No, I don't think so. Thank you for coming again. And I appreciate the comments in the chat. And yeah, I'm really happy I was able to share this research and thoughts with you tonight.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Jon. And just quickly before I let everyone go, we will be doing our next chat in this lecture series on August 18th from 5 to 6. So stay tuned. More information will be posted up on our website. And I hope to see you all there. Thank you so much. And yeah, have a great evening, everyone. Thanks again, Jon.
Thank you.
Bye.